In the quiet beginning of this story, it helps to imagine a city that has not yet learned how to fully control water. A city where water arrives when nature allows it and leaves only as it naturally will. Before the Roman Empire developed its advanced aqueducts, drainage channels, and sewer systems, much of daily life in ancient settlements across the Mediterranean depended heavily on rivers, wells, rainfall, and simple gravity-fed runoff. In early Rome, and in many surrounding Italic settlements, water was both essential and unpredictable. People would draw water directly from the Tiber River, from shallow wells dug into the ground, or from small natural springs when they were available. These sources were often shared among many households, and they were vulnerable to seasonal changes. During dry periods, wells could lower significantly, and during heavy rains, rivers could rise and become turbulent or contaminated. At this stage in history, water was not yet something that flowed reliably into homes or public fountains. Instead, it was something that had to be collected, carried, and carefully stored. Large clay jars, known as amphorae in some contexts, or simple storage vessels in others, were common in households. Water might be fetched multiple times a day, often by servants or family members, and brought back for cooking, washing, and drinking. Wastewater in this early period was handled in an equally simple way. In many homes, waste would be collected in containers and then discarded into nearby pits, streets, or natural drainage paths. Streets themselves often acted as informal channels for runoff. When it rained, water would flow along uneven stone or dirt surfaces, carrying debris with it toward lower ground or toward the river. This way of living was not unusual for ancient civilizations. In fact, it was quite typical for cities that had not yet developed large-scale civil engineering systems. Water management existed, but it was local, small-scale, and dependent on immediate surroundings rather than coordinated infrastructure. As Rome began to grow from a small settlement into a more structured city-state, these limitations slowly became more noticeable. Population growth meant more demand for clean water, and more waste being produced in concentrated areas. Narrow streets, originally designed for foot traffic and small carts, began to see heavier use. The natural drainage of the land, which once handled rainfall without much issue, started to struggle as more surfaces became compacted and built upon. Even so, early Roman society did not immediately transform its water systems. Instead, changes occurred gradually. At first, improvements were modest. Small drainage channels were carved along roads to direct rainwater away from homes. Shallow ditches were used to help prevent flooding in low-lying areas. In some places, stone-lined channels began to appear, marking the early steps toward more permanent infrastructure. But for a long time, these solutions were still reactive rather than planned. They addressed immediate problems, such as standing water after storms or waste accumulating in busy streets, rather than creating a fully integrated system for water distribution and removal. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider how closely tied daily life was to these conditions. Cleanliness, comfort, and even health were directly influenced by proximity to water sources and drainage paths. A home located near a reliable well or spring held a clear advantage. Likewise, homes situated on higher ground often benefited from better drainage, while lower areas could become damp or congested after rainfall. Over time, these differences began to influence how cities were organized. Wealthier residents often settled in more favorable locations, while denser, lower districts faced greater challenges with waste and water management. This uneven distribution created pressure for broader solutions that could serve the entire population more consistently. It is in this context that early Roman engineering thinking began to develop, not suddenly and not as a single invention, but as a slow recognition that water could be guided, controlled, and distributed on a much larger scale. This realization would eventually lead to some of the most impressive hydraulic systems of the ancient world, but at this stage, it was still in its early formation. For now, the city continues to function with a mix of natural flow and simple human adjustments. Rain falls, gathers in streets, and moves downhill. Wells are dug deeper as needed. Rivers remain both a resource and a challenge, and life continues at the steady pace of adaptation, where people work with water rather than directing it in any fully systematic way. In the next section, we will gently move into the moment when Rome begins to shift from these early simple methods toward more deliberate engineering. We will look at how growing population pressures, urban density, and public health concerns slowly encourage the development of more organized water control systems, setting the foundation for what would eventually become the aqueducts and sewer networks of the Roman Empire. For now, it is enough to stay in this early stage, where water is still something that must be carried, managed locally, and lived alongside in its most natural form. As Rome slowly expanded from a modest river settlement into a denser and more structured city, the relationship between people and water began to change in subtle but important ways. What once felt manageable at a small scale gradually became more complex as population growth increased the demands placed on the same natural systems that had supported earlier generations. The Tiber River, still central to daily life, continued to serve as a primary source of water and a convenient route for transportation. But as the number of people relying on it increased, so did the strain on its immediate surroundings. More water was being drawn from the river, and more waste was being returned to it. Over time, this created a cycle that was increasingly difficult to ignore, especially in areas closest to dense habitation. Within the city itself, the streets that once handled light runoff and occasional debris began to experience more frequent and more concentrated flow. When rainfall occurred, water would still follow gravity along the natural slope of the land, but now it encountered more obstacles: tightly packed buildings, uneven stonework, and narrow passages filled with daily activity. Instead of quickly dispersing, water could linger longer in certain areas, creating damp ground conditions and small pools that were difficult to avoid. At first, these issues were treated as part of urban life. Residents adapted in simple ways. Raised thresholds were added to doorways, walkways were slightly elevated in some areas. People became accustomed to stepping around wet sections of street after rainstorms. These were small, practical responses, rather than coordinated engineering solutions, but they reflect an important stage in the evolution of infrastructure: adaptation before system design. As time continued, however, the increasing density of the city made these informal adjustments less effective. With more people living closer together, waste accumulation became more noticeable, and the limitations of relying on natural drainage alone became clearer. Water no longer simply flowed away without consequence. Instead, it interacted more frequently with human activity, and the results were often inconvenient and sometimes unhealthy. It is in this environment that Roman society began to gradually recognize a deeper need for organization in how water moved through the city. This recognition did not emerge as a sudden discovery. Instead, it developed slowly through repeated observation of problems that were becoming harder to ignore. Streets that remained muddy for longer periods after storms, areas that experienced repeated flooding, and neighborhoods where waste disposal was becoming more difficult all contributed to a growing awareness that the city needed more reliable systems. Early responses remained modest. Small drainage channels became slightly more intentional in their placement. Instead of simply following the easiest path downhill, some channels were shaped to guide water away from specific public areas. In certain districts, stone was used more frequently to line these channels, helping them resist erosion and maintain a clearer path for flow. These changes were still limited in scale, but they marked an important transition from natural adaptation toward deliberate construction. At the same time, the importance of clean and accessible water sources became more apparent. Wells and springs that were closer to populated areas were used more heavily, and in some cases, their usage began to raise concerns about long-term reliability. A well that served too many people could become less dependable over time, especially if the surrounding groundwater was affected by nearby waste or heavy usage. This created a subtle but growing tension between access and sustainability. As a result, communities began to place greater value on water sources that were not immediately within the crowded parts of the city. Springs located outside the urban core were seen as more stable and cleaner, though they required effort to reach. This distinction between local, limited sources and more distant, reliable sources would later become a key factor in Roman engineering decisions. During this period, Rome was also developing a stronger sense of public organization. As political and civic structures became more formalized, there was increasing interest in projects that served broader populations rather than individual households alone. Roads, public spaces, and shared facilities began to reflect this shift toward collective infrastructure. Water, as a shared necessity, naturally became part of this emerging focus. Still, at this stage, the city did not yet have a unified system for water distribution or waste removal. Instead, it had a growing collection of partial solutions: improved wells in some areas, better drainage in others, and continued reliance on the natural flow of the land in between. The system was becoming more structured, but it was not yet fully integrated. What is important to understand is that this period was less about invention and more about recognition. The Romans were not yet building aqueducts or large underground sewers. Instead, they were observing patterns. They were noticing how water behaved differently in a growing city compared to a small settlement. They were beginning to understand that scale changes everything, even for something as simple and constant as flowing water. And so, quietly and gradually, the foundations of a more advanced system were being formed, not in stone yet, but in thought and necessity. The problems were becoming clearer, and with clarity came the possibility of structured solutions. In the next section, we will move closer to the moment when Rome begins to act on these observations. We will explore the early steps toward engineered water supply systems, and how the idea of bringing water from distant sources into the city began to take shape, marking the beginning of a transformation in Roman infrastructure thinking. For now, the city remains in this transitional state, where natural systems and human adjustments coexist, and where the need for something greater is becoming increasingly difficult to overlook. As Rome continues to grow in size and complexity, the limits of relying only on nearby rivers, wells, and rainfall become more noticeable in daily life. The city is no longer small enough for water to be treated as something simply found and carried. Instead, it is becoming something that must be planned for, especially as demand increases across both public and private spaces. In earlier times, a well placed in a convenient part of the city could serve a modest number of households without much strain. But as neighborhoods became denser, these same wells began to face heavier use. Water levels would fluctuate more noticeably, and in some cases, the quality of water near heavily used areas would decline. This was not always immediate or dramatic, but gradual changes were enough for people to begin noticing differences in taste, clarity, and reliability. At the same time, the Tiber River remained an ever-present resource, but also an increasingly imperfect one. It provided water, transport, and a natural drainage path, yet it also received the city's growing output of waste and runoff. As Rome expanded along its banks, the relationship between the river and the city became more complex. It was still essential, but no longer ideal as a sole or primary source for clean drinking water. It is in this quiet tension between need and limitation that early Roman thinking about external water sources began to develop. The idea was simple at first: If the water near and within the city was not always reliable, then perhaps the solution lay farther away, in higher, cleaner, and less disturbed locations. Outside the immediate urban core, the landscape of ancient Latium offered numerous natural springs and elevated sources of fresh water. These springs, often emerging from hills or mountain foothills, provided water that was typically clearer and more consistent in quality than that found in the city. Unlike wells, which depended on local groundwater conditions, springs could offer a continuous flow, driven by natural pressure and gravity. However, accessing these distant sources was not straightforward. The challenge was not just finding clean water, but bringing it into the city in a controlled and usable way. This required thinking beyond simple collection and toward the idea of guided movement over distance. Water would need to travel across valleys, uneven terrain, and long stretches of land before reaching urban areas. At this stage, the concept of transporting water over long distances was still emerging. There were no large aqueduct systems yet, and no standardized engineering framework for maintaining consistent flow across varied landscapes. Instead, early efforts likely involved small-scale diversions, simple channels, and localized experiments in guiding water along the natural contours of the land. One of the key principles that began to take shape during this period was the importance of gravity. Without modern pumping systems, water movement had to rely on elevation differences. This meant that sources needed to be higher than their destinations, and the path between them had to be carefully considered to maintain a gentle and continuous downward slope. Even small errors in gradient could interrupt flow or cause water to pool in unintended areas. This realization marked a subtle but important shift in thinking. Water was no longer seen only as something that existed in place, but as something that could be directed through space. It could follow a designed path rather than only a natural one. This idea, while simple in principle, opened the door to entirely new possibilities in urban planning and infrastructure. As these ideas developed, Roman builders and early engineers began to pay closer attention to the landscape itself. Hills, valleys, and natural contours were no longer just geographic features. They became potential tools for guiding water movement. A valley could support a crossing structure. A hillside could support a channel. A gentle slope could maintain steady flow over long distances. Even so, these early attempts were likely limited in scale and experimental in nature. Without advanced surveying tools or established construction standards, much of this work would have depended on careful observation and practical trial. Small sections of channels may have been built, tested, and adjusted over time, gradually improving reliability and understanding. During this period, water management was still not a unified system. Instead, it was a collection of evolving ideas and partial implementations. Some areas of the city may have benefited from better access to spring water, while others continued to rely on traditional wells and local sources. The transformation was uneven, reflecting the gradual nature of technological development. What is most significant about this stage is not the existence of large infrastructure, but the emergence of a mindset. Roman society was beginning to accept that water could be engineered. It could be guided with intention, shaped by human design, and integrated into the structure of the city in a more deliberate way. This conceptual shift laid the foundation for everything that would follow. Without it, there would be no aqueducts spanning valleys, no carefully regulated flow systems, and no large-scale integration of water into urban life. But at this point in the story, these outcomes are still in the future, still forming slowly within observation, necessity, and early experimentation. In the next section, we will move closer to the development of actual engineered water channels and how early Roman builders began turning these ideas into physical structures that could reliably transport water from distant sources toward the growing city. For now, Rome remains in a transitional stage, where water is beginning to move not only through nature, but through intention, guided gently by the first steps of human design. As Rome continues its gradual transformation, the idea of guiding water over distance begins to move from thought into physical form. What once existed only as observation and early experimentation now starts to appear in small, practical constructions scattered around the landscape. These early efforts are not yet the great aqueducts that would later define Roman engineering, but they represent an important step toward them. At this stage, water management is still local and uneven, but the intention behind it is becoming more deliberate. Instead of simply reacting to water where it appears, builders begin shaping paths in advance, anticipating how water should move through the terrain. This shift, while subtle, marks the beginning of engineered flow. Early channels were likely simple in structure. They may have been shallow trenches cut into the ground, sometimes lined with stone where stability was needed, and sometimes left unlined where the soil was firm enough to hold shape. The primary goal was not complexity, but consistency. Water needed to move steadily, without stagnating or spilling into surrounding areas. These channels often followed the natural slope of the land. Roman builders, even in this early phase, understood that gravity was the most reliable force available for moving water. So rather than fighting the landscape, they worked with it. A gentle downhill gradient was enough to keep water moving, provided the path remained clear and uninterrupted. In some cases, where the terrain changed abruptly, small adjustments would have been necessary. A channel might curve slightly to avoid steep drops, or extend longer than a direct path in order to maintain a manageable slope. These decisions required careful attention to elevation, even if the tools for measurement were still relatively simple by modern standards. One of the quiet but important developments during this period was the increasing use of stone and masonry in water-related construction. While earth channels were sufficient in many cases, stone offered greater durability. It resisted erosion, maintained shape under flowing water, and allowed for more permanent infrastructure. Even so, stone construction required more labor and resources, so its use was likely selective rather than universal at this stage. As these early systems developed, they served a variety of purposes. Some channels were likely used to divert rainwater away from roads and buildings, reducing flooding during seasonal storms. Others may have been used to carry spring water towards settlements or agricultural areas. Still others may have helped manage wastewater, directing it away from dense habitation zones and toward natural drainage points. What is important to understand is that these systems were not yet interconnected. Each channel tended to serve a specific purpose or location. There was no single citywide network controlling the movement of water. Instead, there were many small systems functioning side by side, gradually improving the overall management of water within and around the city. Even in this fragmented form, the benefits were noticeable. Areas that previously experienced frequent pooling after rain could now drain more efficiently. Certain public spaces became more usable throughout the year. In some cases, access to cleaner water sources improved slightly, especially where channels helped bring spring water closer to populated areas. At the same time, these early engineering efforts also introduced new challenges. Channels required maintenance. Sediment could build up over time, slowing flow or redirecting water unintentionally. Heavy rains could overwhelm shallow structures, causing overflow or damage. As a result, maintenance became an increasingly important part of water management, even at this early stage. This need for upkeep reinforced another emerging idea, that water systems were not static structures, but living systems that required ongoing attention. They had to be monitored, adjusted, and repaired as conditions changed. This understanding would later become a fundamental aspect of Roman infrastructure management. Gradually, as experience accumulated, builders became more skilled at predicting how water would behave in different conditions. They learned how slight changes in slope could affect speed, how surface materials influenced flow, and how seasonal variations could impact performance. This growing knowledge base, built through observation and repetition, became just as important as physical construction itself. In this way, early Roman water channels represent more than just infrastructure. They represent the beginning of a systematic relationship with the environment, where natural forces are not only endured, but gently guided. The city is beginning to extend its influence beyond buildings and roads, reaching into the movement of water itself. Yet despite these advancements, the system remains incomplete. Water still enters the city from many different sources. Distribution is uneven. Waste management is only partially controlled. And the idea of a unified water network, while increasingly possible, has not yet been fully realized. In the next section, we will move closer to one of the most important turning points in this story, the development of early aqueduct thinking, and the realization that water could be transported across long distances using carefully engineered gradients and continuous channels. For now, Rome continues to refine its early systems, slowly turning scattered ideas into more reliable forms of control, and laying the groundwork for a much larger transformation still to come. As Rome continues to grow, the limits of small, local water systems become increasingly clear. The early channels and drainage structures that once felt like meaningful improvements are still useful, but they are no longer enough to meet the needs of a larger, denser city. Water demand is rising steadily, not only for drinking, but for bathing, cooking, public fountains, and the expanding rhythm of urban life. At this point in the story, a quiet but important shift begins to take shape in Roman thinking. Instead of asking how water can be managed within the city, attention begins to move outward, toward the landscape beyond it. The question slowly changes from how do we use local water more effectively to how do we bring better water into the city itself. This change in perspective is subtle, but it represents a major turning point. It requires imagining water not as something tied to a specific place, but as something that can travel deliberately across long distances while maintaining a steady, controlled flow. Outside the city, the natural environment of the Roman countryside offered an important advantage. Springs located in higher elevations, particularly in hills and mountain foothills, produced water that was often cleaner and more consistent than sources within the urban core. These areas were also less affected by waste accumulation and human density, making them especially attractive as potential supply points. However, the challenge was not the existence of these sources, but their distance. Bringing water from elevated rural areas into the heart of Rome required more than simple channels. It required continuity over long stretches of terrain, careful control of slope, and a reliable understanding of how water behaves over distance. It is during this stage that Roman engineering begins to move toward a more unified concept of long-distance water conveyance. While not yet fully developed into the aqueduct systems that would later define the empire, the underlying principles are beginning to emerge more clearly. One of the most important of these principles is the idea of maintaining a continuous gradient. Water, moving under gravity alone, must always flow from a higher point to a lower point. But over long distances, even very small changes in elevation become significant. A path that is too steep can cause erosion or excessive flow speed, while a path that is too flat can cause stagnation. Achieving a balanced slope over kilometers of terrain requires careful planning and attention. This understanding encourages a more thoughtful approach to surveying and construction. Even if the tools available at the time were relatively simple, builders would have needed to observe the land closely, estimating elevation changes and adjusting routes accordingly. Instead of following the shortest path, water channels would often follow the most stable and controllable path. In some cases, this meant extending routes significantly in order to maintain a consistent descent. A direct line between 2 points was less important than ensuring that water could travel smoothly without interruption. This principle would become one of the defining characteristics of Roman water engineering. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of reliability. Local water sources, while convenient, were vulnerable to seasonal variation and contamination. Distant springs, by contrast, offered more stable output. Even though they required more effort to access, their consistency made them more valuable for long-term planning. This trade-off between distance and reliability begins to shape Roman infrastructure thinking in a deeper way. It reflects an early understanding that engineering is not only about convenience, but about stability over time. A system that is harder to build may still be preferable if it performs more consistently once completed. During this period, the idea of sustained flow also becomes more important. Water is no longer viewed as something that simply arrives and is used immediately. Instead, it is beginning to be treated as a continuous supply, something that can be maintained through carefully designed systems that operate over long periods with minimal interruption. This concept naturally leads to more structured thinking about infrastructure as a whole. If water can be brought into the city from distant sources, then it must also be distributed within the city in a more organized way. This begins to hint at a broader system where supply, movement, and drainage are all connected parts of a larger network. Still, at this stage, these ideas remain in development. There is no single, fully integrated system yet. Instead, there are growing patterns of thought and practice, slowly converging toward a more sophisticated approach. Builders are learning from experience, refining techniques, and gradually improving their ability to shape water movement with intention. What is especially notable about this period is how much of the progress comes not from sudden innovation, but from accumulation. Each small improvement in channel design, each better understanding of slope, and each successful attempt to bring water from a slightly more distant source adds to a growing foundation of knowledge. In the next section, we will move closer to the emergence of true aqueduct construction, where these principles begin to take physical form on a much larger scale. We will explore how Roman engineers started transforming long-distance water thinking into monumental infrastructure that could reliably serve an entire city. For now, Rome continues to expand its understanding of water as something that can be guided across distance, shaped by landscape, and integrated into the structure of civilization in increasingly deliberate ways. As Rome continues to expand, the gradual accumulation of knowledge about water movement begins to reach a more decisive stage. The earlier ideas about long-distance flow are no longer just observations or small experiments in the landscape. They are beginning to take shape as structured plans with clearer goals and more deliberate execution. At this point in the story, the concept of bringing water into the city from distant, elevated sources becomes more than a possibility. It becomes a practical solution to a growing urban challenge. The demand for clean, reliable water is no longer something that can be met through wells, rivers, or small local channels alone. The scale of the city has moved beyond those limits. What emerges in response is the early foundation of what will become the aqueduct system. Not yet the monumental arched structures often associated with Rome, but a more fundamental engineering concept: a continuous, controlled channel that carries water from source to destination, using only gravity, guided carefully by the landscape. The key idea is continuity. Unlike earlier local drainage channels, which could begin and end in short sections, these new systems require an uninterrupted path. Water must travel steadily over long distances, without losing flow, without pooling, and without breaking in elevation. This requires a level of planning that extends far beyond individual construction sites. To achieve this, Roman builders begin to think more systematically about elevation control. The entire route from source to city must be designed with a consistent downward gradient. This is not something that can be improvised during construction alone. It must be carefully planned in advance, based on a growing understanding of terrain and slope. Even without modern instruments, early engineers could observe patterns in the land. Hillsides, valleys, and natural contours provided visual cues for elevation change. By following these features and adjusting paths accordingly, it became possible to maintain a controlled descent over long distances. The process was slow and careful, requiring patience and repeated observation. As these ideas develop, construction begins to reflect a new level of coordination. Channels are no longer built only where water is needed locally. Instead, they are part of a larger route that connects distant sources to urban distribution points. This requires a more organized approach to labor, materials, and planning than earlier smaller systems. In some areas, open channels carved into the ground would still be used. In others, early forms of lining or covering may have been introduced to protect water quality and reduce contamination from debris. The idea of protecting water during transport becomes increasingly important as distances increase and exposure to the environment becomes longer.
One of the subtle but important challenges during this stage is maintaining flow consistency. Over long distances, even small imperfections in gradient or channel shape can affect how water moves. A slight dip in the route could slow flow or cause temporary pooling. A sudden change in slope could increase speed and lead to erosion or structural stress. These challenges require continuous adjustment and refinement. As a result, early aqueduct thinking is not just about building a single structure, but about managing a system that must remain stable across varied terrain. It is a balance between engineering design and natural geography, where success depends on both careful planning and ongoing adaptation. During this period, Roman society also begins to place greater importance on public water access. As water systems become more reliable, the idea of shared distribution points begins to develop. Instead of each household relying solely on private wells or local sources, water can be delivered to central locations where it is accessible to many people. This marks a subtle shift toward more collective infrastructure thinking. Although these early systems are still limited in scale and reach, their significance is substantial. They represent the first time water is being treated as a city-wide resource that can be actively managed from source to destination. This is a conceptual leap as much as a technical one. It is also important to recognize that these early aqueduct systems would have required significant effort to construct. Even simple channels over uneven terrain demand careful excavation, support structures in certain areas, and ongoing maintenance to ensure continued function. The work would have been slow, methodical, and highly dependent on skilled observation. Yet despite these challenges, progress continues. Each successful section of channel reinforces the idea that large-scale water transport is not only possible, but sustainable. With each improvement, confidence in the system grows, and the vision of a fully integrated water network becomes more realistic. In the next section, we will move closer to the introduction of more advanced Roman engineering techniques, including the development of covered channels, tunnels, and early forms of surveying that allowed for even greater precision in water management. For now, Rome stands at the threshold of a major transformation. Water is no longer just something that flows through the landscape. It is becoming something that can be guided across it with intention, forming the foundation of one of the most influential infrastructure systems in ancient history. As Roman water systems continue to develop, the focus gradually shifts from simply moving water across distance to protecting it along the way. Once water begins traveling farther from its source, its journey becomes more vulnerable to the surrounding environment. Dust, debris, animals, and even changes in weather can all affect the quality and consistency of flow. In response to this, Roman builders begin to refine the structure of their channels. Open trenches, while still useful in some areas, are no longer always sufficient for longer routes. A new idea slowly becomes more common, covering the water as it travels. Covered channels represent an important step forward in water management. By enclosing sections of the aqueduct path, water is shielded from direct exposure. This helps maintain cleaner flow and reduces the risk of contamination. It also helps stabilize temperature and evaporation, especially during warmer seasons when open water can be more easily affected by heat and air.
These covered sections were not necessarily complex at first. In some cases, stone slabs may have been placed over channels to form a simple protective roof. In other areas, earth may have been packed above stone-lined trenches, creating a buried conduit that allowed water to move unseen beneath the surface. The approach would vary depending on terrain, materials, and available labor. What is important here is not uniformity, but intention. Roman engineers are beginning to recognize that water is not only something to be transported, but something that must be preserved during transport. This shift reflects a growing sophistication in how infrastructure is understood. It is no longer just about reaching a destination, but about maintaining quality throughout the journey. At the same time, the introduction of covered channels brings new practical challenges. Once water is enclosed, it becomes harder to observe directly. Any blockage, leakage, or structural issue is no longer immediately visible from the surface. This means that maintenance must become more planned and systematic, rather than reactive. To address this, builders begin to incorporate access points at intervals along the channel routes. These openings allow workers to inspect, clean, and repair sections of the system without needing to uncover large portions of the structure. While simple in concept, this represents an important step toward long-term infrastructure management, where systems are designed not only for function, but also for upkeep.
As these improvements develop, the overall reliability of water transport begins to increase. Water that leaves its source now has a better chance of arriving in the city in a clean and steady state. Even as distances grow longer, the system becomes more resilient, able to withstand environmental changes and minor structural imperfections. Another subtle development during this period is the increasing integration of water channels into the landscape itself. Instead of being purely visible surface structures, aqueduct paths begin to blend into the terrain. Some sections run along hillsides, carefully carved into rock. Others pass beneath the ground entirely, following natural contours in a way that minimizes disruption to the surface above. This approach reflects a deeper understanding of efficiency. Rather than forcing the landscape to conform entirely to engineering needs, Roman builders begin to work with the environment more harmoniously. The terrain is no longer just an obstacle to overcome, but a framework to be used. In flatter regions, where elevation control is more delicate, careful leveling becomes especially important. Even small deviations in slope can affect flow consistency over long distances. As a result, greater attention is paid to gradual gradients and smooth transitions between sections. The goal is to maintain a nearly continuous movement of water, steady and uninterrupted. Over time, these refinements lead to a more dependable system. Water can now travel farther with less loss, fewer interruptions, and improved quality upon arrival. This reliability has important consequences for urban life. Public fountains become more consistent. Bathhouses can operate more regularly. Households that rely on shared distribution points experience fewer shortages. Still, despite these improvements, the system remains a work in progress. Maintenance is ongoing, and expansion continues as the city grows. Each new extension of the network introduces additional complexity, requiring careful planning to ensure that existing flow is not disrupted. What is becoming clear during this stage is that Roman water engineering is evolving into something continuous and adaptive. It is not a single project with a defined endpoint, but an ongoing system that must respond to both natural conditions and human needs. In the next stage of development, Roman engineers begin to tackle one of the most visually striking and technically demanding aspects of their water systems: crossing uneven terrain using elevated structures, and early forms of bridge-like construction to maintain consistent flow across valleys and dips in the land. As Rome's water systems continue to expand outward, the terrain itself begins to present one of the most persistent challenges yet.
While covered channels and carefully graded paths work well across gentle slopes and stable ground, the natural landscape of central Italy is not always smooth or predictable. Valleys, dips in elevation, and uneven ground begin to interrupt what would otherwise be a steady downward flow. Water, as always, must follow gravity. It cannot be forced upward without additional energy. And so Roman engineers are faced with a simple but demanding requirement. The path of least resistance is not always a straight line. In many cases, the most reliable route for water is one that bends, rises, and spans across difficult terrain, while still preserving a consistent overall gradient. It is in this context that more advanced structural solutions begin to appear. Instead of relying solely on buried channels or ground-level conduits, Roman builders start elevating sections of the water system above the landscape. These raised structures allow water to pass over valleys and low-lying areas without losing the carefully maintained slope needed for continuous flow. At first, these elevated sections may have been relatively modest. Low walls or embankments could support a channel slightly above ground level, enough to maintain continuity across minor depressions. But as the need for longer and more reliable routes increases, these structures begin to grow in scale and complexity. Stone becomes increasingly important during this phase. Carefully cut blocks and masonry construction allow for stronger, more stable supports. Arches begin to emerge as a key architectural solution, not only for bridges and buildings, but also for carrying water channels across uneven terrain. The arch distributes weight efficiently, allowing structures to span wider gaps while maintaining strength and durability. Even though these early elevated water systems are not yet the monumental aqueduct arcades often associated with Rome, the underlying principle is the same. Maintain a continuous, controlled path for water across a landscape that does not naturally provide one. The introduction of elevation also requires more precise planning. When water is carried above ground, stability becomes critical. Any structural weakness could affect the entire flow system. Engineers must consider not only the slope of the channel itself, but also the strength of the supports beneath it, the spacing of structural elements, and the long-term durability of materials exposed to weather. This stage of development reflects a growing confidence in large-scale engineering. Roman builders are no longer only adapting to the land, they are actively reshaping how water moves across it. Valleys that once interrupted flow are now bridged. New areas that once required detours can now be crossed directly, provided the structures are
Despite their strength, these structures still require careful maintenance. Stone can erode over time, joints can shift slightly, and environmental conditions, such as rain, wind, and temperature changes, can gradually affect stability. As a result, inspection and repair become ongoing responsibilities, integrated into the life cycle of the system, rather than treated as occasional tasks. Water quality also remains an important consideration. Even though elevation helps bypass difficult terrain, exposure to the open air introduces new risks. Leaves, dust, and other natural materials can enter exposed sections if not properly managed. This reinforces the continued importance of covered channels in combination with elevated structures, creating a hybrid system that balances protection with functionality. Over time, these innovations begin to work together more seamlessly. Covered underground channels protect water during long stretches of travel. Elevated sections carry it across valleys.
Carefully graded paths ensure that gravity continues to guide the flow without interruption. Each part of the system serves a specific purpose, but all are connected by a shared principle: controlled movement over distance. What is emerging at this stage is no longer just a series of improvements, but a recognizable system of infrastructure. Water is now part of a coordinated network that extends beyond individual neighborhoods or local solutions. It is becoming a city-wide system, shaped by engineering, maintained by human effort, and guided by natural forces working in harmony. And yet, even with these advancements, the system is still evolving. Each new extension brings new challenges, and each new challenge leads to further refinement. Roman water engineering is becoming not just a method of construction, but a long-term practice of adaptation, observation, and gradual improvement. In the next stage of development, attention begins to shift toward the interior of the city itself, where water must be distributed, managed, and shared among an increasingly dense population through fountains, baths, and public infrastructure.
As water finally reaches the edges of the Roman city through aqueducts, covered channels, and elevated crossings, the focus of engineering begins to shift once again. The challenge is no longer only about bringing water into Rome, but about how that water is gently distributed once it arrives. At this stage, the city itself becomes an active part of the water system. Rome is not simply a destination for water anymore. It is a network of streets, public spaces, and buildings that must all be supplied in a steady and controlled way. The arrival point of water is only the beginning of its journey through urban life. One of the most important features of this internal distribution system is the public fountain. These fountains serve as shared access points where people can collect clean water for daily use. Unlike earlier periods, where water had to be carried from rivers or wells in scattered locations, fountains create centralized points of access that are more reliable and easier to maintain. Water arriving in the city is typically stored in holding tanks or distribution basins before being directed into these fountains. From there, it flows continuously, driven by gravity and carefully controlled outlets. The constant movement of water is important, not only for supply, but also for maintaining freshness. Stagnant water is avoided through steady flow, allowing excess to spill away and be replaced. As fountains become more common, they begin to influence the layout and rhythm of the city itself. People naturally gather around these points throughout the day. Water collection becomes a shared, routine activity, and the design of urban space begins to reflect the importance of access. Streets near fountains tend to be more active, forming quiet centers of daily life. Alongside fountains, another major component of Roman water distribution emerges: the public bath system. Bathhouses rely on a continuous supply of water to support large pools, heated rooms, and washing areas. These spaces are not only functional, but also social, providing a place for rest, hygiene, and conversation. The ability to supply bathhouses consistently marks a significant achievement in water engineering. It requires not only bringing water into the city, but regulating it carefully so that demand can be met without disrupting other uses. This introduces a more complex layer of control, where water must be divided, prioritized, and maintained across multiple destinations. To manage this, distribution points within the city become more structured. Water is directed through a combination of channels, tanks, and controlled outlets that allow it to be allocated where needed. While the exact mechanisms vary, the principle remains the same. Water enters the city in bulk and is then gradually shared through a system designed to maintain balance. At the same time, wastewater begins to play a more organized role in the system as well. As water is used in fountains, baths, households, and public spaces, it does not simply disappear. It continues to move, often entering drainage channels that guide it away from populated areas. These drainage paths connect back to earlier sewer systems, creating a continuous cycle of movement through the city.
This is where earlier developments in covered channels and underground conduits become especially important. The same principles that protected clean water during transport now help manage used water as it exits urban spaces. Wastewater is guided away in controlled ways, reducing flooding and improving overall cleanliness in dense districts. Even though the system is far from modern standards of sanitation, it represents a significant improvement over earlier, less organized methods. Water is no longer simply entering and leaving the city in an uncontrolled manner. It is being directed, reused in movement, and guided through defined pathways. As these systems become more established, they also require ongoing management. Fountains must be maintained to ensure steady flow, channels must be kept clear of blockages, distribution points must be monitored so that pressure and supply remain balanced. Water infrastructure becomes a continuous responsibility rather than a one-time construction effort. What is emerging in this stage is a fully integrated urban water experience. Water is present in public life in a visible and structured way, shaping how people move through the city and interact with shared spaces. It is both practical and environmental, supporting daily needs while also influencing the structure of urban living. Yet even now, the system is still not static. Rome continues to grow, and with that growth comes increasing demand, greater complexity, and the need for even more refined engineering solutions. The water system must continue to evolve alongside the city it serves. In the final stage of this story, attention gradually shifts toward the long-term legacy of Roman water engineering and how these systems influenced not only the empire itself, but also the future of civil infrastructure across the world.
As the Roman water system reaches its most complete form, it becomes less of a single invention and more of a long, connected achievement built over generations. What began as simple reliance on rivers, wells, and rainfall has slowly transformed into a coordinated network that moves water across landscapes, through structures, and into the heart of a growing city. By this final stage, the system is no longer just about engineering individual parts. It is about maintaining a balance between all parts working together. Distant springs feed aqueduct channels. Those channels carry water across valleys and along carefully controlled gradients. Covered sections protect it during long stretches of travel. And once it arrives in the city, it is distributed through fountains, baths, and regulated outlets before continuing onward through drainage paths. Everything is connected by a shared principle. Water must move continuously, gently, and predictably, guided by gravity and shaped by human design. What is striking about this system is not only its scale, but its durability. Many of the principles developed during this period remain foundational in civil engineering, even far beyond the Roman era. The use of gravity-fed flow, the importance of controlled gradients, the separation of clean supply from wastewater, and the idea of distributed public access points are all concepts that continue to influence water infrastructure in later civilizations. In Rome itself, these systems allowed the city to grow to a size that would have been difficult to support otherwise. Public fountains provided accessible drinking water, bathhouses operated on a scale that supported hygiene and social life, drainage systems helped manage waste and reduce the impact of flooding in dense urban areas. Water became part of the city's structure, not just its background environment. But beyond their practical function, these systems also represent a deeper shift in how humans relate to natural resources. Water was no longer something that simply arrived with the seasons or flowed where it naturally chose. It had become something that could be observed, understood, guided, and maintained over long distances and long periods of time. This shift required patience and accumulation of knowledge over many generations. It
was not the result of a single discovery, but of continuous refinement. Each improvement in channel design, each better understanding of slope, each successful extension into more distant terrain added to a growing body of practical engineering experience.
Even the limitations of the system are part of its story. Maintenance was constant, structures required repair, flow had to be monitored. And as the city expanded, new extensions were always needed. The system was never truly finished because it was always responding to the changing shape of the city itself. In this way, Roman water engineering can be understood as a living structure. It existed in a state of ongoing adjustment, shaped as much by use and environment as by initial design. This adaptability is one of the reasons it remained effective for so long. Over time, the influence of these ideas extended far beyond Rome. Later civilizations studied and adapted Roman methods, applying similar principles to their own cities and landscapes. The concept of aqueducts, controlled distribution, and integrated drainage systems became part of the broader language of civil engineering. And even today, many modern water systems still reflect these same foundational ideas. Gravity remains one of the most efficient ways to move water. Clean supply and wastewater are still carefully separated, and large-scale infrastructure continues to depend on careful planning, long-term maintenance, and an understanding of natural terrain. As this story gently comes to a close, it becomes clear that the Roman water system was never just about pipes, channels, or structures. It was about learning how to work with a fundamental force of nature in a way that supports daily life, quietly and consistently across an entire civilization. And in the background of that achievement is a steady rhythm of flow, water moving through stone, through earth, through cities, guided carefully and almost silently from its source back into the world around.